Well, today we're going to be talking about a really interesting topic, and that's affordable housing. And this topic is way more complicated than I ever knew. And to help sort through the details and a lot of what the city is doing, I have a guest here in my studio, Ken Wada with our Advanced Planning Department. Ken, thanks for being here today.
You're welcome.
So, Ken, I was talking with you earlier. The city has recently created this strategic plan that addresses affordable housing. And before we get into the details of that, can you help us get our hands around what are we talking about when we say affordable housing?
Affordable housing, there's a classic definition that was established by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. But it's basically, without going into the numbers, it's lower income families that are working, and you'd be surprised at the types of people who are working in Fort Collins whose incomes need or cannot afford to either buy or rent housing in Fort Collins. But it's these working people who are paying too much of their salary for either rent or purchasing a home. So what we try to do is to make sure the family is within those limits so that they're not paying too much for housing, so that they have funds available for food, medicine, entertainment, transportation, those types of things.
What is that ideal percentage? So you should be paying what percentage of your income towards housing?
Well, again, now you get into two percentages.
Okay.
The first one that you asked about is 30%.
Okay.
That if a family of low income, and the low income is defined as being 80% of the area median income, which is about $60,000 for a family of four. So a family at 80% of the AMI, if they're paying more than 30% of their gross income, then they're paying too much for housing, and the housing that they're in is not what's considered to be affordable.
Okay, so let's bring that down to a more tangible level. I read somewhere, and I know these statistics are a little bit old, but there was a campaign that really talked about what that means and what it takes to afford a home. And essentially it said that you need to earn roughly about $14 an hour to rent the average two-bedroom apartment.
Correct.
And then it was something, I don't know if it was 22 or 27. You'll have to
around 27.
$27 an hour to afford the average home.
Right.
Those are significant incomes. I mean, that's more than an average teacher makes, more than an average administrative assistant or office manager
and those
makes.
are the types of professions that I think people would be surprised that begin to fall into the affordable housing needs category. Like you mentioned, teachers, entry-level police services, firemen, obviously your retail clerks, office workers, servers in restaurants. They do not make sufficient income to do the average rents or the average house costs in Fort Collins.
It's sobering when you think about that. And I guess my other question would be, so what's the scope of the problem, so to speak? I've always, Fort Collins is a very well-educated, it's perceived as a fairly affluent community. What is the scope of challenge? What are we looking at in terms of affordable housing?
Well, we have a tremendous need for affordable housing, particularly on the rental side. About a year and a half ago to 2 years ago, we, the city of Fort Collins, collaborated with Larimer County and the city of Loveland using some state division of housing money to do a housing needs assessment on a countywide basis. But the consultants that did the study also provide data, individual data for Fort Collins and Loveland. And just in the rental market need alone, we are below, we need like 5,000 units to handle. And this excludes, they had to factor out the students, because the students complicate the data, because students typically do not report the high incomes, yet they have other sources, mom and dad are helping them pay the rent and stuff like that. So they had to statistically remove the students from the analysis, and then still came up with that amount. Now, these people aren't homeless.
Right.
They're, again, not meeting the definition, so they may be housed, but they're paying more than that 30% of their income for housing costs.
Another issue that I read about was this concept of they're either paying too much or more than they really can afford, or there's more than one family in a home.
A lot of people address their housing issue by doubling up with friends or family members because they can't afford to live individually. So they do collaborate with each other. And that creates overcrowding situations
Right.
and other issues.
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about then the city's approach to affordable housing. I mentioned the strategic plan that was updated last year, I want to say, and there's really a few key issues within that plan. And one that I picked up on seemed to be a concern for not only creating new affordable housing, which is a priority, but also sort of preserving the affordable housing units that we have now.
Right. We have, since around 1990, the city of Fort Collins has become strategic in its approach to affordable housing assistance. There are needs across the entire spectrum. The lowest end is emergency shelter.
Right.
People who just don't have a home and they need shelter for an evening and a cold night or something. All the way through, single room occupancies, heavily subsidized rental units, other rental units, up to home ownership opportunities. There's needs across that entire spectrum. But the city cannot be all things to everybody.
Right.
So this housing needs analysis that I mentioned, we had to look at that spectrum and find out where the greatest need was. And we're going to concentrate our effort over the next, say, 3 to 5 years on dealing with the most significant issues. And that doesn't mean we're going to ignore the other ones.
Right.
But the top priority in the strategic plan, which was adopted last July by the City Council, was to add to the inventory of rental units for families below the 50% of AMI level, really more so towards the 30%. We're talking about the lowest of the low
Right.
income. That's where the greatest need is. So we need to put more units into the inventory. The second priority is to preserve what we've got. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the first one,
Sure.
because you can't be adding to your inventory on one hand and losing your inventory on another,
Right.
because then you're going to have a net zero.
Right. So how do we lose inventory? I'm somewhat familiar with sort of like the Habitat for Humanity model, which says, sort of once an affordable housing unit, always an affordable housing unit.
Right. In its way, some of the affordable housing projects are financed, and some of the financial institutions that are providing the assistance to make the units affordable in the first place have a time limit.
Okay.
And once the time limit is adhered to, then the owners of that property can get out of the affordability component
Okay.
and rent it at a market rate. And what we try to do then is preserve them as affordable units once those tax credits or federal home loan bank loans
Okay.
are no longer there, and the conditions for those are no longer tied to the properties.
So how long is that typically, how long is that time period? Is it 20 years?
Well, it varies by the type of funding, but one of the more significant financial assistance programs is the low-income housing tax credit program.
Okay.
And from the investment perspective, there's a 15-year requirement. But the Colorado Housing Finance Authority, which operates the tax credit program for the state, they add another 15 years of what they call a land use restriction on the property. So tax credit projects are at a minimum of 30. Sometimes they go to 40 depending upon the type of tax credit they get or the financial assistance. The city's code requires a minimum of 20. But we're going to be looking at that minimum, and it's one of the things to look at in our strategic plan. There was an action plan, and it said we need to look at that affordability commitment time frame and maybe look at expanding it out to 40 years.
Wow. I mean, it really is about that long-term planning. It seems
Right.
probably, when put in place, 20 years is so far down the road.
Right.
Let's back up to talking about getting more affordable housing units or getting them more available, creating more units. How can the city be involved with that? We actually don't own any affordable housing units.
The city of Fort Collins itself does not own or operate any affordable housing units. Now, there is the Fort Collins Housing Authority, which is a
Right.
separate governmental entity altogether, and they're part of the sort of the HUD Section 8 rental assistance program, and they have a development arm, the Fort Collins Housing Corporation, that acquires and rehabs or builds new affordable units too. And the city's role is kind of multifaceted. First of all, we provide financial assistance. And the financial assistance can come from one of our two federal programs, the Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG program, or the Home Investment Partnerships program, or the HOME program. And those are pass-through dollars. They come to the city from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and we have two funding cycles where we solicit applications, and then it's a competitive process, and we
Okay.
give the funding out to the proposals that best meet what our priority needs are.
Do those proposals come from individuals or developers?
They come from both for-profit developers
Okay.
and nonprofit agencies like Care Housing or Neighbor to Neighbor,
Okay.
and the Housing Authority too is involved. But we're starting to see more, which is a good sign, more private developers trying to get into the mix because that's what we need too, because the nonprofit agencies are somewhat limited in their ability to handle a lot of this demand.
Right, and development is not a cheap endeavor.
No.
I mean, it really
Now,
is.
added to the federal programs, the city council, when they adopt the annual budget for the city of Fort Collins, they also allocate money into an affordable housing fund. And that gives us just another sort of line item, another pot of money. And the benefit of the Affordable Housing Fund is because it's our money, it doesn't come with all the federal regulations and stipulation stuff. So we have a lot of flexibility on how we can use the city's affordable housing funds.
So back to the plan, it's about getting new units. It's
Yes.
about keeping existing units.
Right.
And then there's a whole section that addresses special needs.
Right. The third priority is housing or facilities for people with special needs, and that can be seniors, homeless people, handicapped people. So that's a separate category as the third priority. And then our fourth priority, and these are all priorities, it doesn't mean,
Right. There's not necessarily a hierarchy.
right, it's for assistance to first-time home buyers.
Okay. There's a statistic in the plan, or perhaps in some of the outreach campaigns that you've done, that says something like 50% of, I believe it was men in the shelter, are working.
Yes.
They're not unemployed. And to me, it was just a really telling statistic about, where we are as a community, and really, again, that not only that face of affordable housing, but that face of homelessness. How does the city work with some of the existing homelessness initiatives here in our community, and is there some synergy between all those efforts?
Yes, and again, we try to really change people's perceptions and any stigmas that are given to, affordable housing or homeless people and stuff. We mentioned the types of professions that don't earn enough to rent or buy, but homeless people are working. A
Right.
lot of them are working. It's just that they just are not earning enough to find their own, places
Right.
to live. And the city is very involved with, Homeward 2020. Diane Jones, the deputy city manager, is on the executive board of that effort. I'm on a much larger group of people who are meeting monthly now to, use the information that's been recently gathered in the surveys and the homeless census and try to make an action plan and how are we going to address this issue to end homelessness in 10 years.
It's no small feat for sure, but it seems like a lot of energy and a lot of good energy behind it. Another piece of that was addressing the senior community, and I thought this was also interesting given where we are in terms of our population.
Right.
So obviously people are getting older, living longer.
Right.
How is that going to impact the need for
Well,
units?
as you mentioned, the demographics of the country are changing. The baby boomers are getting older, and a lot of the baby boomers are not going to want to stay in the type of housing that they're currently residing in.
Right. I'm all ready to stop doing my lawn work, so I can
I know.
imagine another 20 years.
Yeah, but exactly, lawn maintenance,
Right.
house maintenance and stuff.
Shoveling,
like
all of that stuff.
Two-story buildings, people want, one-story things. So there's going to be that kind of shift in need. And, Fort Collins has a very good reputation as an excellent place to retire. We've, in fact, of some of the more active projects that are being considered for funding right now, at least 3 of them are senior-oriented housing. We know the demand is, and they know, they've done their market studies, they know the demand is either there, it's coming very shortly, it's going to take them a year or two to, get from where they are now to begin to turn dirt to actually produce the unit. So they're starting those processes now so that when they're ready to be
Right.
occupied, there's going to be a market for them.
Yeah.
But senior housing is going to be real critical in this community.
So on the other end of the spectrum, this idea of assisting first-time home buyers.
Right.
I can remember buying my first house and it being the most overwhelming and complicated and expensive proposition. I mean, it's the biggest purchase you're likely
Sure.
ever going to make.
Right.
What kind of assistance are we offering? Is it solely financial, or is there some sort of education piece to it as well?
Well, it goes hand in hand again. And now we're talking about people who are closer to the 80% AMI level.
Okay.
They're in the 60 to 80% sort of, range. We're not talking about people in the 30 to 40% range. These are people whose salaries can't afford a monthly mortgage payment, but they lack the kickstart to get into the unit. They can't come up with the $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 they need for, to pay the down payment and
Right.
closing costs. So that's when the city can step in, and with our home buyer assistance program, we provide that kickstart. We provide the down payment assistance, and we provide the closing cost assistance. And we do it through a zero interest deferred loan. So it doesn't it doesn't become amortized,
Right.
so they don't have to make monthly payments, but there is a lien on the property, and if they ever sell the unit or change title for whatever reason somewhere into the future, the city would get that money back.
Okay. That's really interesting. And I remember, again, that being sort of the hardest part is trying to scrape together that down payment.
Right.
And at the same time, when we first bought our home, now this is kind of back in the real estate boom, I mean, they were giving away mortgages with zero down, like, candy. It's like trick-or-treating out there.
Right.
How do you see sort of the changes in loaning practices and lending practices? How do you see that influencing what we can do and provide in terms of affordable housing?
A lot of what I've learned over the last 30 years in dealing with affordable housing issues basically is being thrown out because
Right.
the whole financing
Right.
situation is completely changed now. And it's hard for me actually to answer that question. And I know on the rental development side with the tax credit programs and stuff like that, I mean, it's brand new ball games out there.
Right.
And we're trying to catch up and become better educated as to what's really happening in the financing world, what the equity lending institutions are requiring and stuff. And we've got some catching up to do. Now, interest rates are, somewhat down, relatively speaking, for families to, get a mortgage out of a lending institution. But again, it's coming up with the money to pay for the down payment. And that's
not easy.
difficult.
Yeah, that's not easy to do.
Right.
It's really not.
And we have some complications with one of our funding sources that was traditionally used to help pay for that down payment assistance. We've basically determined that those funds cannot be used anymore, and it's leaving about a $4,000 or $5,000 gap in the down payment assistance, and there aren't low-income families out there with that kind of cash laying around.
Absolutely, absolutely not. What about for the people out there watching right now who, we kind of went through these professions of, teachers and, firemen and women and, sort of these key, what you would think is very solid professions. What about those people out there who are like, okay, if you just said AMI was about 60 grand and you're talking about 80% of that, like I fall into that category. How do those people get help?
Well, they have, for home buyer assistance, we have a process. They make
Right.
an application to us, and then, we have to look at their income tax returns and make sure they qualify from an income thing. And they have to get, they have to have a realtor, they have to have a lending institution. They have to do all that background work themselves, and then we do all the paperwork to make sure. And one thing we definitely don't want to do is find families that are marginal where we're setting them up for failure.
Right.
We don't want that to, in 3 years or 4 years from now, have the family say, we can't sell the unit, and we're seeing a lot of that now because the market's been flat. It's even regressed
Yeah.
in some place, and people are, being foreclosed on, having to do short sales. It's pretty rough out there still.
Right. Affordable housing and the programs that we're talking about, you can see sort of the direct benefit to individual families and people. But there's also a greater sort of community benefit. I mean, and talk a little bit about that relationship.
Sure. I mean, Fort Collins prides itself as being a diverse community. And part of that diversity is through the lower income people that provide goods and services to everybody on a daily basis. We don't want to become an exclusive, upper income
Right.
community only. So there's definitely the social, benefit. There's the economic benefit. These people are part of the labor pool. And there's the environmental benefit that if they can't afford to live here, they're going to move to an outlying community. And then if they're going to work here, they have to commute in somehow.
Right.
And that's usually by private automobile. So they add to the traffic congestion, which degrades our air quality. So it's really, affordable housing is not just a social issue. It's an economic issue and it's an environmental issue.
Do you guys have statistics on sort of how many people are either living in Fort Collins and then also working in Fort Collins, or say living in, Greeley and driving into Fort Collins, or vice versa?
Right. The Metropolitan Planning Organization does surveys occasionally and talks about the migration or the commuting patterns. And of the workers living in Fort Collins, I think the statistic is something like 17% of the people who have jobs and live in Fort Collins commute out of Fort Collins for those jobs. Loveland, it's like 45 to 50%
Wow.
commute out. Now, a lot of them go to Denver, a lot
Sure.
of them go to Boulder, and I think in Greeley it's like 33 or 35%, and a lot of them will also go down 85 to, but Fort Collins is a net importer of jobs, so more people drive or come into Fort Collins for their job than live in Fort Collins and go elsewhere.
It's not a small issue to tackle. I appreciate the work that you guys are doing on it. If people are interested, you can go to fcgov.com/affordable housing.
Correct.
The strategic plan is there. The needs assessment that you
Yes.
mentioned, Ken, is there. If
Descriptions
you
of
like
all our
data,
programs.
man, that is the place to be.
Yes.
There's some really impressive background information that's sort of driving how the city participates. And before we go, I just want to talk a little bit about something else that's online there, which is this poster campaign.
Yes.
Which interestingly is what caught my attention is some of the stats and the photos of people who are looking for affordable housing. Tell us a little bit about the sort of concept behind it. And
The concept was both education and awareness. Again, I mentioned before when you mention affordable housing, a lot of people have a stereotypical sort of image that comes up of the type of people that need affordable housing.
Right.
And we wanted to break that. We wanted to really get the information out and say, these are the type of people in Fort Collins who need affordable housing. And it's, the teachers and everything that we talked about. And we thought one of the better ways to do that was through this poster campaign. And we'd put them up in, social service agencies, public buildings, grocery stores, so when people go by and they can look at that. And the original concept was to have a photo of those types of professions with a question at the top, say, which of the people pictured below need affordable housing in Fort Collins?
Right.
And then under the photo would be all of the above.
oh wow,
But the greatest compliment that we've received for that poster campaign was being copied. A friend of ours from the group was on the National Board of Realtors, and he took our posters to Washington, D.C. for a board meeting one time, and he laid them out on the table. And that executive board just went nuts. They said, "Can we use these? Boy, that's a great idea." And, it's now like, I think the number is like well into the 30s, between the 30 and 40 in terms of agencies or states throughout the country that are using poster campaign to increase the awareness of affordable housing.
It's amazingly effective and definitely caught my eye when I was online earlier today. So a great campaign. Encourage folks to take a look at it and to also just spend some time on the site learning a little bit more about where we are in terms of affordable housing in this community and some of the resources out there. So Ken, with that, I want to thank you for joining
Thank
us
you very
today.
much.
I really do appreciate it. And I want to thank you all for joining us as well. And we'll see you next time on Studio 14.